The problems are really big. They're kind of existential. Like inequality is rampant. Artificial intelligence is coming. There's a sense in both our countries that I'm not sure that the future is going to be as good as the past was. And politicians tend to be talking to us in kind of these sound bites, or they're very cautious about what they say, or they're very bombastic. If you're a Farage or a Trump, you're telling people who to hate and who to blame. And I think people are actually ready to hear someone tell them some hard truths.
Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Christian Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast where we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. Today's guest sat at the heart of power during a defining era of American politics. Ben Rhodes helped craft the speeches of Barack Obama that carried across the world, inspired millions, and shaped America's sense of itself, what it's for, what its identity is. As speechwriter and Deputy National Security Advisor, he was deeply involved in steering foreign policy too, including the Iran nuclear deal, abandoned by Donald Trump in favor of war, and a ceasefire now that delivers much less. He has become famous as an author and the co-host of Pod Save America. And his new book, All We Say, examines American history through 15 speeches. Its struggle over national identity, the pendulum swing between progressive change and equality and white supremacy and nativism. Ben, welcome.
Great to be here.
If you could change the world with one fell swoop, what would you do?
If I could change the world with one fell swoop, I would... I say this as an American, I would remove money from politics. How about that? I feel like we're living in an age of massive corruption, and so many of the outcomes, particularly in the United States, but then that filters out around the world, have to do with the ways in which I think we've been corrupted. I mean, even if you just look at how social media has polarized us, that's rooted in algorithms that profit off of our division, right? So I actually think people almost underappreciate the extent to which the bad outcomes that have people upset about politics and the economy in so many different countries, I think has an origin in the massive amounts of corruption.
I mean, removing money from politics has been an ambition of many people for eons. Do you think it is more acute now and that the money is able to make its presence felt more on modern politics than it was before?
There's no question. In the United States, there was a Supreme Court decision in 2009 that removed any guardrails on the amount of money in politics. And so if you look at what has happened in American politics since then, it is all to the bad. And I think it accounts for the runaway inequality that we have in the United States. We just had our first trillionaire in Elon Musk. It accounts for the massive power of tech oligarchs in the United States and the kind of incapacity to regulate these technology platforms. And I think it also accounts for the sense that people have that they don't feel in democracies in the US, Europe, and other places, they don't feel any agency. And so I think it's contributed to this turn to kind of a strongman populism, because in the absence of agency, it's like, well, I'm going to look for someone who looks like they're a strongman that can just kind of blow up this whole system. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the US at least is instead of blowing up the system, it's like, how can I better profit off the system?
I mean, there are obviously a lot of parallels between America and British politics. They don't run in sync, I think. In some ways we're a bit behind, and in some ways we're a little ahead. But those populists and those strong men and women, I suppose, are trying to ease us into a world in which we would all aspire to be like them, that it's a good thing that they're super rich, that it's a good thing that they are, making even more money than most people can imagine, and that's a sign of their success and why they're good to lead. Is that becoming part of American national identity as well?
Well, I think it always has been, actually. I think there's always been something in the American subconscious that admires the person who succeeds, right? That the American dream is the premise that you can come from nothing and there's no limit on what you can acquire and accomplish. And I think that has often been tied up with wealth and entrepreneurship. But I think that actually part of what's happened is that idea has been kind of hacked by the Donald Trumps and the Elon Musks of the world. Trump, it's interesting, the speech I focused on in my book from Trump, and I use this as the title of my chapter, is his second inaugural. And what he says in that speech, he has a line that I think encapsulates so much of Donald Trump and his appeal. He says, "I will win for you." And it's very much like your question. It's like, you might not win, like you might still be poor, your job may not be coming back, but look at me, I'm winning. And so if I'm winning, you can kind of, through osmosis, benefit from that. I think Elon Musk, the same thing. I think he's the kind of entrepreneur that Americans have often admired throughout American history. This guy built things out of nothing, seemingly. Tesla, SpaceX, and now he's $1 trillion. But what is Elon Musk doing with all that money in politics? He's trying to dismantle, or actually literally did try to dismantle parts of the federal government that Americans depend upon, medical research in the United States or international development abroad. And so I think what we've seen is this very American, deference to success and almost kind of a cult of success. A Trump or an Elon, they've used that to kind of justify their own behavior having essentially no guardrails around it.
I mean, now, the sort of the central, I suppose, conceit of the book is that speeches matter.
Yeah.
And that they are central to forming ideas, and that's where arguments are had and where you convince a nation of who it is and what it should want. Speechwriter thinks speeches are really important.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yes.
But, in the modern world, how important are speeches now?
I think they're less important, and I think that's part of what's gone wrong. Because, one of my arguments in the book is that America in particular, because we're not anchored in one particular place. We were 13 states, now we're 50 with territories. We're not anchored in one particular ethnic group. There are people from all over that comprise American identity. We have no state religion or even predominant historical religion. Speeches are where we've kind of adjudicated this question of, well, what does it mean to be American? Who gets to decide that question? And as you said in your introduction, I think there's always been a kind of reactionary, kind of exclusive nationalism that is rooted in a kind of a white Christian identity, an inheritor of Western traditions. And other people can be in the United States, but they're kind of subordinate to this predominant identity, or this kind of progressive story that America is dedicated to the proposition that everybody's equal. And we're trying to close the gap between reality and that ambition. And speeches, if you look at our history, if you look at the abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, or presidents like Lincoln and FDR, or activists like Martin Luther King, or even up through Obama, the words of an I Have a Dream speech, were an effort to kind of speak into reality that more egalitarian and progressive identity. I think what we've seen in the last, decade is that because of social media, because of the fracturing of discourse, nobody listens to a whole argument anymore. People consume clips that are designed by an algorithm to trigger them, to make them really angry at the people they disagree with, or really affirm that they're correct. And what we've lost in the process is that ability to talk to one another and to have a sense that there's like a shared national identity. It's all competition ricocheting around the internet. And I think part of the reason we're so disoriented in the United States, and I'd say in other countries, here in Britain, you have similar questions about identity, I think post-Brexit, that have kind of been the backdrop to all this political chaos. I think the absence of people being able to stand up and explain to people, okay, here's where we are, here's who we are, here's where we need to go. I think that's part of the reason why people feel so kind of out of balance.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking this morning, actually, that there are so many echoes of that in British politics at the moment.
Yeah.
If you think about why Starmer is so disparaged, people feel that he failed to lay out his core values in a way that the country could understand and get on board with. And that's what people are hoping Andy Burnham will do now as he comes in. And there's this sense that, well, I think I have a greater sense of his values, but he needs to lay them out. Do you think we as a political culture are able to take the big argument in?
Not right now. And I think, to your point, first of all, because I think, well, I'll get to the fact that I think people are ready for it, but I felt a lot of echoes in watching Keir Starmer for the last year and a half to Joe Biden, in the sense that part of the message was the other people are a little crazy and a little scary. I'm sober. I'm responsible. I'm going to restore some normalcy and stability. I have an agenda that, if you break it into pieces, could be popular. We're trying to make the healthcare system work better. We're trying to lower prices, trying to recreate growth, all things that poll well. But there wasn't a sense of watching Starmer. What's the story? Like, where are you trying to lead us? Like the problems, and here's why I think people are ready for it now. The problems are really big. They're kind of existential. Like, inequality is rampant. Artificial intelligence is coming, and is that going to take our jobs? Is my kid going to be friendly with chatbots? There's a sense in both our countries that I'm not sure that the future is going to be as good as the past was. There's chaos in the world. There's wars in multiple fronts. And politicians tend to be talking to us in kind of these sound bites, or they're very cautious about what they say, or they're very bombastic. If you're a Farage or a Trump, you're telling people who to hate and who to blame. And I think people are actually ready to hear someone tell them some hard truths, right? I mean, part of the thing I reflected on is like, what makes a speech resonate with people? Like, I think people are ready to hear, okay, like, this is difficult. Here's where we are, But people need to be convinced that we can get out of this, and that there's a horizon beyond the present. We're so trapped in the present on our phones. And speeches are the places where politicians or movement leaders in the past, particularly in the United States, and it's true to an extent here too, have been able to kind of make people see a way out of a disorienting present.
I mean, the other thing that the book reveals is that there really are no new ideas in politics.
Yes, that's right.
If you think about the coverage of Trump in America and Farage in Britain, the word unprecedented is used a ridiculous number of times.
Yeah.
And the truth is, it's very, very precedented.
Yeah.
You go back to early populism.
Yeah. Yes.
Tell me about Mary Lease.
Yeah, I'm so glad you pointed to that speech, because it was interesting. So Mary Lease was one of the leading orators of the American populist movement in the late 19th century. And she was kind of this remarkable figure who came out of nowhere, right? She lived in Kansas. She had been an immigrant herself, had come from nothing, really, no means. They'd failed as farmers, her and her husband. And she started going on the speaking circuit, which in those days was like public entertainment in the United States. And she gave this speech that on the surface could look like it was, Bernie Sanders in the United States. Wall Street owns this country. This is a government of, by, and for Wall Street. And so it's a lot of economic populism. But she also had a message. This is after the American Civil War. The white working class of the North and South needs to reunite. We've wasted too much time on things like black political rights. The populist ticket that she supported literally embodied that, with a Union general and a Confederate general on it. She had a kind of weird scheme that she advocated to colonize Latin America and basically have white people running a plantation economy down there. And what I think I learned in kind of inhabiting that populist explosion in the United States is it was very much a populism of the white working class. And it represented a kind of frustration that the Civil War and the Reconstruction period in the US, which was a lot about black political rights, had kind of distracted us from essentially the predominant identity of the country being white people, and that these systems had gotten too distracted by these other agendas. And so you saw that a Trump who speaks like a populist sometimes on economics, right? These trade agreements have been bad for the working class. It's shipped your jobs overseas. And oh, by the way, the immigrants, Mary Lease was very against immigration. Even though she was an immigrant herself from Ireland, she wanted to ban foreign ownership of land. She wanted to kind of, she was part of a movement to, exclude Chinese immigration to the United States. So there's always been a kind of nativism to American populism. I mean, also in the book, I have a chapter that deals with like the America First isolationist movement in the 1930s. The xenophobia, isolationism, anti-immigrant politics, the idea that populism is about the unity of the white working class and smashing an establishment. There's a lot, Trump is different in some ways, but there's a lot of DNA in American history that flows into Trump from the past.
And does it essentially stem from race and the way people feel about immigrants and black people?
I think so. I think that's core to it. It was interesting writing this book because I started writing it in 2021. I worked on it for 4 years. And that was kind of the time when there was a backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement and the post-George Floyd protests in the US. And so I was almost kind of like, shaped to not see everything about race by that backlash. And yet, when you go back into American history, like the core argument from the founding, from the Constitution, which is where I begin the book, was kind of about who's an American. And the Constitution, very famously left out Black people. They were counted as 3/5 of a person in the compromise that produced the Constitution. Slavery still existed. And kind of repeatedly, yes, we argue about the size of government. Yes, we argue about economic policy. But the kind of core existential question of like, what does it mean to be American has always been tied up in race. And the compromises, I start with Benjamin Franklin defending the Constitution, defending the need for compromise. We can't have a union if we don't all compromise. The things they compromised about were identity, slavery, who is a full citizen. Immigration was not really dealt with in the Constitution. It was kind of left up to the states. And ever since then, the kind of most acute political periods of turmoil in the United States, obviously the Civil War, the end of Reconstruction, the 1960s, today, there's always been a kind of racial component tied to either, Black political rights or immigration that I think we ignored our peril.
So what do you think is the essential difference then between that kind of right-wing populism and Ronald Reagan? Who is still, I suppose, now sort of being retaken by, the anti-Trump Republicans as the kind of Republican they would like to be. You look at his Evil Empire speech in the book. Is it just that he was much more concerned with the bigger questions, the foreign policy questions, and the threat of communism?
I thought Reagan was a fascinating. So the book ends, this is not all presidents by any stretch, but I ended deliberately with Reagan, Obama, Trump. And it was a dizzying experience. Those are kind of the three predominant political figures of the last 50 years. And that speech that Reagan gave, it also, I think, demonstrates why words matter. Reagan would not have become president without speeches in the same way Obama wouldn't have. It was his communication that allowed him to do that. That speech is famous for him calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. But actually, that was only a small part of the speech. It was a speech to the National Association of Christian Evangelicals in the United States. And what he's doing in that speech is he's literally kind of speaking into being what the Reagan coalition was. It was Christian evangelicals, and a whole part of that speech is about abortion and prayer in school and kind of America's identity being kind of at core Christian. Small government libertarian conservatives, the idea that government itself seeks to tell you how to live your life, and is trying to take away Christian identity, and it's kind of godless, secular bureaucrats making decisions. And then the Soviet Union, the contrast he makes is not capitalism versus communism. It's we believe in God. They believe in the rule of man. Communism is a godless ideology. That's why it's an evil empire. And so in some sense, Reagan is knitting together this coalition that is, Trump inherits it, but obviously takes it in different directions. And I find a lot to disagree with about Reagan. And I think at core, there's some white identity politics in what Reagan did. Like he was a bit part of the backlash to the civil rights movement. He famously launched his general election campaign in 1980 in Mississippi, in a place, Philadelphia, Mississippi, where a church had been bombed. He's kind of saying, and he gave a states' rights message, which is code in the United States for, we don't want the federal government to tell us what to do on things like race. However, Reagan was very pro-immigration. Reagan is the last US president who signed a bill giving amnesty to people who are undocumented in the United States. And he spoke eloquently in defense of immigration. I think he actually did believe he believed so much in the kind of idea of an America that, you can come here and you can strive and you can make it. And he saw immigration as an advantage over the Soviet Union. We get to take people from everywhere. And so actually the core difference to me between a Reagan and a Trump is that Reagan saw American identity as something that should be available to people who are coming from other places. Trump sees it as something to be kind of almost protected from people coming from other places. And I think that core difference explains a lot, and may have something to do with the end of the Cold War. That after the end of the Cold War, it's like there's a part of the Republican Party, and I read a lot about Pat Buchanan, who ran for president in 1992 on an America First and immigration, tear up trade agreements, Trump before Trump kind of message. There's a sense in the kind of nativist wing of the Republican Party after the Cold War that like, well, now we can pull up the drawbridge, and now we don't have to do all these things overseas. And I do think that explains a lot of how the Republican Party can go from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump.
How much do you think the electorate, though, has changed? I mean, you talk about Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan was regarded widely as pretty extreme. That these were not ideas that America wanted to embrace. And he was, I remember, covering him here as kind of like, as a bit of a wild man on the right. His ideas are pretty mainstream now.
They are. I mean, actually, it's funny. I originally was going to have a speech by Pat Buchanan in 1992 because it was so eerily, he wanted to build a wall on the southern border. He declared a culture war. He was very pugilistic about how he talked about, issues like homosexuality. Like there's a lot of familiarity to it. I ended up using Trump instead because he won the election. I think two things happened. One is a structural change, that the promises of globalization, ironically, the promises of the world that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, as much as any two people kind of created, free markets, unbridled capitalism, and to some extent, the free movement of peoples, even if that wasn't necessarily what they emphasized, that put more and more pressure and strain on working class populations in the United States, including white working class populations. And so there was a frustration with the whole system that had been constructed that led people to be looking for political outsiders. And in some ways, Barack Obama benefited from that in 2008. He ran as a political outsider against not just the Bushes, but the Clintons too. This whole system has to change. Then the other thing that happened is we elected a black president, and look, I'm not here to say Barack Obama did anything perfectly, but when people kind of pushed me on the backlash to some extent to Obama, I think, frankly, some of that was less about dissatisfaction with some particular policy of Obama's and more of the sense that he was emblematic of a future that was not white, in which the United States is on the way to becoming a majority non-white country, in which there are these immigrants coming here, the president's black. And so the structural changes and then this kind of big cultural shift of a black president being elected kind of, opens a space for Trump. And if you look at our history, each time there's a major advance in civil rights, there's usually a reaction against it. Reconstruction is followed by segregation. The civil rights movement is followed by Nixon. Obama's followed by Trump. Like that, there's a push and pull to history that has been typical in America.
Having been there, what do you make of the sort of he can't win element when it comes to Obama, in that, for people who were hostile to the idea he was a black president, for a lot of black activists, they say he didn't govern as a black president.
Yeah.
He didn't. Did he ever intend to govern as a black president?
No, he was always like very adamant that the best thing actually for black Americans would be if he governed, as a president for everybody. And that frankly, even the policies that he pursued that were going to help black Americans the most would be things like having healthcare reform that would make healthcare more affordable to everybody, but that would, particularly help black Americans who, by greater numbers, lacked healthcare coverage, for instance. That he would weigh in on issues that were of particular importance to certain black communities, like police brutality. But if he kind of led with that, he did want to kind of racialize his position. And frankly, like when I look back on those years, he was held to kind of a different standard. Infamously in the United States, people may have followed here, like there'd be these scandals like Obama wore a tan suit, that's not presidential, he needs to wear a dark suit. And meanwhile, Trump is having Ultimate Fighting Championship, events on the White House lawn, like that.
Wearing baseball hats when American coffins come home.
There was a sense, I don't know if it's Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's, Obama kind of walked across thin ice for 8 years, but I think he thought that the best thing he could do is demonstrate hey, here's a black man who can do this job well with a, admirable character, a scandal-free administration, a admirable and dignified family that everybody could see. And actually, I think, ironically, his very success in doing that is part of what triggered certain people to be like, no, we're going to elect Trump. We're going to show you that, we can have this guy, an undignified white guy. I think that no one would want to acknowledge that, but there was kind of an intangible, because it's funny going back into history in this book, Frederick Douglass was very similar. He in the sense that he was so articulate and so powerful in his argumentation, and he so educated that he was disproving white supremacy at a time when white supremacy was the predominant reality in America. And there was kind of a reaction against that, it's threatening to have it confirmed that white supremacy is a lie, And again, America's not quite as structurally white supremacist in the 2010s as it was in the 1860s and 70s. But I do think there's a bit of a push and pull between the very demonstration that, hey, actually, this country doesn't need to just be governed by white men, can trigger a backlash because people are like, well, we need to reassert ourselves here.
So can I talk a little bit about you in the Obama administration then, and why you were there and what you were wanting to do? Did you go in there to change the world? Did you see him as an inspiring man who would change things on a huge scale?
I did. I mean, I wrestled with this a bit at the end of the book that, I think that I came of age in the 90s when it did feel like history had a very particular direction. The civil rights movement had succeeded to some extent. The Cold War had ended. Democracy was predominant. Then there's this kind of these Bush years that, that's when I entered into politics that felt, hey, we're making huge mistakes here, the war in Iraq in particular. And then Obama comes along with the speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention. I'd never seen anything like that. I thought, in my household growing up, the heroes were the Kennedys and Martin Luther King. And here's this guy who's speaking in that language. And I was like, this is the guy that, we've been waiting for, And so I went to work as a speechwriter at the beginning of that campaign and foreign policy advisor. And I do think coming in, I had this sense, particularly seeing how that campaign took off and words were moving people around the world, as you said, that I think more than Obama himself, people like me who worked for him, because Obama, I think, as a black man and as a man who lived in places like Indonesia, he understood power, resists change and it's incremental. You have to kind of grind out change. It doesn't just all happen like a lightning bolt. I think I probably had more of an assumption that he was in a continuum of history that was moving in one direction. And when I look back now, I see pride in some of the things we did. I certainly feel pride in the way he carried himself, the words he spoke. But I see that history never goes away, and it ebbs and flows. And so I have kind of adjusted my sense. Obama would often quote the line, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." But it's not a clean. I still believe that, but it's not a clean bend. It bends and then bends back, and then you can bend forward. And I think I've definitely hard learned that lesson.
So has that changed your attitude towards what leaders should try to achieve with their time? That they should try and achieve much more quickly? I mean, that seems to be what Trump learned in his second term from his first, that you've got to go hard and fast because some of it will be pushed back on when you're gone. And if you want to achieve lasting change, you've got to go hard. Yeah,
I think that's a very fair point. I think it's correct. I mean, I put it this way. I mean, if you just look at the Obama years, we only, he governed for 8 years. I was there for all 8 years. We only had majorities in the U.S. Congress in the first 2 years. And we did a lot in those 2 years. The vast majority of his agenda was passed in those first 2 years. However, I often think about, what if we'd known that we were only going to have those 2 years with majorities of Congress? We probably would have tried to do more. We didn't. We tried and failed repeatedly after those first years, say, to do immigration reform in the United States and never got it done because Republicans always killed it. A lot of the things that some of my progressive friends, and I'm fairly progressive, complain about, I say, well, we actually tried to do all those things. We just couldn't get them through Congress. But so I do think like you got to move as fast as you possibly can. Where I differ a bit is some of the things Trump does or has done, they're outside the rules.
Yeah.
So I still think, and actually think that's dangerous. I think if we just start saying, let's all ignore the rules, then it becomes kind of a race to the bottom. So I think there's a lesson to be learned about moving fast and going as big as possible. But I think the lesson has to still stay inside the agreed upon boundaries.
Just while we're here, can I ask you about the Iran nuclear deal? I mean, you were obviously very involved in the crafting of that, and we've ended up in a situation now where whatever Trump is trying to negotiate is probably going to be less than the original deal achieved. Could you see then, what the limits were in Iran very clearly?
Yes. And I mean, the way I put this is, we could, if we went down the list of everything we did in the Obama administration, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I wish we'd done better or things that I think were wrong. This is not one of those things. And at the time, for instance, Prime Minister Netanyahu made the exact same presentation to us that he reportedly made to Donald Trump. Like, this is a weak regime. You need to deal with this nuclear program with military force. The regime will collapse. And so we war gamed it. And we literally sat in the White House Situation Room and did a war game. And as soon as you bomb the nuclear program, well, they're going to close the Strait of Hormuz, because why wouldn't they? They can do it. 20% of the world's fossil fuel energy flows through it. Then they've kind of got a gun to the head of the global economy. We also did not think that there was any way that regime would collapse because of airstrikes. It's a country of 94 million people. That regime has millions of people under arms. So we thought that they would hang on. We also knew you can't destroy a nuclear program from the air. You'd have to send in ground troops to literally get all the pieces and take it out. That's incredibly risky. Americans don't want to lose people in a ground invasion like that. And so we tested the military option and found that to be not at all something that we wanted to do. And then diplomacy, at the time, the criticisms of the Iran deal were like, well, the things that aren't in it. Well, we spent years negotiating it, and that was the best we were going to get. Sometimes in diplomacy, and this is something Americans have a hard time, accepting, you don't get 100% of what you want by definition. And so if we could get these restrictions on the program, if we could ship out their stockpile, that's what Trump calls the nuclear dust these days. If we get inspections in there, if we could get the whole world in on this through the UN Security Council, that's good. We put a lid on this thing. We don't have to worry about Iran having a nuclear weapon, even if there are going to be other things that we don't like that the Iranians do. And now we've seen what it looks like both ways. We had a nuclear deal that they were complying with. Trump pulls out of it, ends up in the very war that we war gamed. And yeah, they're not going to get, not only was if they do get a nuclear deal, it was not worth this war and the loss of life in Iran, the US, and other places. It was not worth the massive economic impacts, including here in the UK. It was certainly not worth like the shortages that everybody's feeling in the global economy. And they're so desperate to get out of the war that they're actually making concessions on the front end to the Iranians and billions of dollars in sanctions relief, basically the de facto controlling of the Strait of Hormuz. They can toll it before they've even made nuclear concessions. And so I think it shows, once again, and I don't know how many times Americans have to learn this, that sometimes not every problem needs to be seen as a nail where you grab a hammer, that military solutions are actually not solutions.
And I mean, I've just come back from Tehran, actually, and it's a hard place to get a handle on.
Yeah.
After all of that negotiation, what did you feel instinctively about what the Iranian instinct was or what they wanted? Were they an evil empire? Are they an evil empire? Do they want to dominate and destroy? Are they... What are they?
I'm so glad you're asking this question, because I spent a lot of time trying to understand this. I don't claim to understand it perfectly. But first of all, it's not a monolithic system. And I think people don't understand this from the outside. There are religious clerics. There are kind of almost military dictatorial figures like in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And then there are politicians, right? And so it's a diverse system with hardliners and more moderate forces. But what unites them, to your question, is the survival of their government, a nationalism, an Iranian nationalism. And it can be religious or military or political, but we are not going to capitulate. That is completely embedded in that state, particularly the post-1979 revolutionary government, that we're not going to capitulate. We're not going to capitulate under sanctions. We might make concessions, but we're not going to fully capitulate to your demands. And we're not going to do that under military force. I think the other thing, and here I kind of fault the American right wing and the Israeli government, particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, their survival instincts, yes, lead them to sometimes do things that are aggressive, and horrible, right? I mean, they wanted to prop up Bashar al-Assad because that was part of their survival instinct. We need kind of buffer states and allies in this region. We're willing to kill lots of people. So this is not to defend their conduct. But the way that Netanyahu and the American right talk about them as if they're completely fanatical people who want to, acquire missiles and nuclear weapons and launch them at everybody, and they're kind of almost suicide bombers, like in terms of their conduct. I don't think that's true. I think they're even if I find them reprehensible in their conduct against their own people and in parts of that region, they're quite sophisticated people, and they're quite intelligent. Trust me. Like, we were at the negotiating table with them for years, and they want to survive.
And just finally on this, I mean, your position on Israel seems to have changed over the years a little.
Yeah.
Do you think America's has? America is Israel's key ally. A lot of Democratic politicians are much more critical of Israel now than they ever would have been before. Yeah. Is that a lasting change?
I think it is. And my position, I was kind of like adversarial to certainly the Netanyahu government in the Obama years, often because we were fighting about the Iran nuclear deal and Palestinian issue. I think where my position has changed is I have to recognize what's happening with my own eyes. Like, if I look at Gaza, I see a genocide. I see, at a minimum, if you want to put that aside and have a debate about the legalism of that, war crimes. Like, I don't think anyone could sit at a table and say there's been no war crimes committed. And I see no sincere effort. What Democrats often would do is they'd hide behind, we're for a two-state solution and we want to support Israel unconditionally. Those things to me are not consistent, because this Israeli government, by its own words, would like to annex the West Bank, And so to me, as a matter of policy, how can you give military assistance to a government that ignores everything you say in its conduct in war? How can you say you're for a two-state solution and give unconditional support to a government that is clearly not for that? And look, if you look at the polling, that's where over 3/4 of Democrats are. That's where almost half of Republicans are. And most importantly, if you look at people who are under 50, it is overwhelmingly where people in both parties are. And so the reason I think that this will be a sustained shift in the Democratic Party and probably in American politics is that's where public opinion is. The politicians are actually behind the public opinion on this one. And I think unless the Israeli government changes, and I would welcome that. I don't want to be against the Israeli government. I'd prefer that they go in a different direction. But if they continue to go further and further to the right, which has been the trajectory over the course of my life, I think that they are going to lose American political support.
The book ends with Trump's second inauguration speech. I mean, you are effectively beseeching the Democrats to write the reply, aren't you?
Yes.
Is it coming?
I think it is coming because,
and is it going to come as a speech? Because,
I think it has to.
Some people, American politicians are embracing podcasts, social media as their primary way of making arguments. And as you've made clear, that's not the way to make an argument. Yeah,
and this is really important. First of all, I think one of the things I learned writing the book is how much technology and the medium changes how people speak. Beginning of my book, it's Ben Franklin. People hear the speech or in the room. The speech is reprinted in newspapers. Those are carefully crafted arguments. Then there's this era of kind of performance, Mary Lease on the circuit, oratory matters. Then radio comes along, careful explanation. Franklin Roosevelt masters that. Television comes along, and it's charisma. That's Kennedy, that's King. Well, now we're in an era of social media. And Trump is kind of perfect for this era because he gets up there for an hour and kind of rants. and it doesn't have to hold together as a speech, but it's going to ricochet around the internet and polarize people and benefit him politically. However, I think the mistake Democrats make is they think that we have to mimic this form of communication, even if we don't say the things that Trump does. We have to go on podcasts and we have to have clever social media videos, and maybe we should curse, because it's authentic. And actually, I think what they forget is you need to know what story you're telling first. Like, what is a speech is where you work out your message. I mean, as someone who's a speechwriter, Obama would refine what he said, speaking over and over again. He'd get the story straight. I would hope that some people would listen to the whole speech and the whole story. But importantly, all the other communication is better if you know what you're saying. Like, if you know what the story is, if you know what the vision is, if you know where you're telling people about where you want to go and why, the social media videos are better. The podcast appearances make more sense. It all holds together. The speech is the trunk of a tree, and every other communication is a branch. And if you look at some of the younger Democrats who I think may run for president, like a John Ossoff of Georgia, he's telling a coherent story about how corruption is, responsible for the outcomes that you're feeling on inflation, on healthcare. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has a kind of joyful fearlessness in her speaking that kind of permeates her politics and makes people think, well, maybe we can change things, right? And so I think that the way to counter-program Trump, that second inaugural and all of his communication, is not to just skip ahead to like, well, we have to show up on this podcast or do this social media video. It's to tell people a coherent story about what can come after Trump. Make people believe that there's an alternative future. Trump wants to trap you in the present. He wants you on your phone. He wants you triggered. He wants you angry. He wants you polarized. And I think a speech is necessary to be not the thing that everyone will watch, but the thing that will, again, form that trunk of a story that can lead people to like, we can actually get beyond this, and this is what it could look like.
And to sort of young progressives who are thinking, I'd quite like to have done what he did. I mean, people have to step up, don't they?
They do, yeah. And they have to, because also, like, the book, like, if you look at the book, like, it's not just politicians, it's activists. Like King, imagine the civil rights movement without King's rhetoric, The need to tell stories is something that is on activists and politicians. And I talk a lot about the tension and kind of collaboration between activists and politicians. I think right now, progressive activists in the United States, sometimes they see their only job as holding power to account and not persuading, not speaking only to each other and not to people that disagree. And look, again, it's not to say Obama's perfect, but what Obama would do is Obama wouldn't show up and say, this is a racist country, and you all must acknowledge that before we can, have a conversation. He'd say, this country is so great that it's been able to change in the past. And he would tell the whole sweep of American history from a progressive perspective. We were able to abolish slavery. We were able to get workers' rights and women's rights. And now join me in the next, frontier of change, which can be everything from healthcare policy to, yes, racial justice. He invited people in. He would try to stand in the shoes of the people who disagreed with him and literally describe, the speech I have in here, he describes the world from the perspective of not just black people, but the white working class too. And so I think what politicians have to do is be more ambitious in the story that they tell. I think what activists have to do is return to persuading and not just talking to each other.
Ben Rhodes, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for joining us on Ways to Change the World.
Great talking to you.
You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.